But what kinds of therapies um, would be beneficial, most beneficial for folks who um, are affected by these chronic health conditions?
Yeah.
So the book, Your Emotional Type, is really kind of a menu of therapies based on your boundary type and the kinds of conditions you might be most susceptible to because they are more than a particular germ or a particular identifiable cause. It's not COVID. It's not the common cold. Um, we're talking about more complex conditions that really have to do with what's happening within. And our contention is how people handle the energy of feelings.
I'm struck by the term the seven discomforts. Can you remember them off the top of your head? What are the seven
Uh,
discomforts?
it's uh, it's the dozen discomforts.
Oh, the dozen.
We
I'm sorry.
you're right on the seven because we identified what we call the super seven treatments, the
Ah, oh,
complementary and alternative or integrative
oh, I
treatments
want to hear about
that
those too.
have the most evidence behind them, or at least did about 10 or 11 years ago when we released this book. But the 12, the dozen discomforts are asthma, allergies, chronic fatigue, depression, fibromyalgia, hypertension, irritable bowel syndrome, migraine, PTSD, psoriasis, and eczema together, rheumatoid arthritis, and ulcer.
Okay, I'm sure there's something that binds those together. Well, and I guess that's kind of what you're getting at. Uh, that somehow they're tied into how we deal with our emotions and what are that we differ in terms of emotional style, which is probably unconscious. We probably each have an unconscious emotional style, if you will. Is that a good word,
That's
style?
exactly right. That's
Okay.
exactly right. There's a great anecdote in the book. There's a psychiatrist in Australia, if I'm remembering, or maybe New Zealand, who I was reading one of his papers, and he had a couple, a married couple, in for therapy, and um, she was paralyzed from the waist down. She had been in an auto accident or something. She was paralyzed, and they were having a very difficult conversation about their sex life. And she was saying, I want to have as much of a sex life as we can, and you're not treating me like a full human being. You're treating me like damaged goods. And the husband was complaining that it took so much of his energy to look after her, and he barely had energy to have any physical relations, and it was a very contentious, very difficult, fraught conversation.
Yeah.
And the writer of this paper, Stephen Appel, it just dawns on me, Stephen Appel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I think it's Appeel, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
He said, I took all of this in, and it was his job to try to help them navigate these shoals. And he said, it was after the session was over, I felt like I had been just hit with a ton of bricks, and I got a migraine from my troubles. And so here's a guy who's conversant with feelings. That's his stock and trade, right? Is to help
Yeah.
people when they come into treatment, help them parse these things. But it was such a difficult conversation. The stakes are incredibly high. He didn't react to it immediately, but afterwards he said he got a migraine. And the way Dr. Makosi and I look at this, migraine is indicative of a thin boundary personality where nonetheless the energy of that feeling or feelings goes underground and it's sort of dissociated. And the power of the dissociated feeling manifests in the migraine. Whereas somebody else who maybe is constitutionally thicker boundary wouldn't have a migraine, but would get an ulcer later on. Um, or would deal with chronic fatigue, let's
Yeah.
say. So that's our contention, and there is evidence for it, and that's the kind of thing that we cite as evidence. It's anecdotal, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence as well as the HPA activation that we use to sort of figure out which conditions reflect which boundary type.
Yeah. So tell us about the seven treatments that emerged, at least at that time, uh, as best suited to deal with these kinds of things. And of course, I think of, well, I believe Dr. Hartman was trained as a psychoanalyst. Am I right about that?
Yes, in fact, his father, you may know, his father, Franz Hartmann, was a disciple of Freud. He was in Freud's circle way
Uh-huh.
back when.
Wow.
So yeah, he comes from that tradition.
Okay, so tell me about the seven approaches, but I have to believe that some form of depth psychology is going to be important, whether it's psychoanalysis or something else.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Jungian psychology before, um, and synchronicities and so forth, and I became highly interested, thoroughly interested in depth psychology. James Hillman and Jung, um, probably around the same time as I was getting interested in all this other stuff in the mid '90s. But
Yeah.
I've actually spoken to the Jung Society of DC, I think 3 times at this point, and that's anyway. We can get into that, but the Super Seven of therapies are acupuncture,
Hmm.
hypnosis, biofeedback, meditation, yoga, guided imagery, and relaxation techniques. Those are
That's
the
interesting.
seven.
And I've been involved with all of those in the course of my training and personal experience. So that's yay.
It covers a good part of the waterfront, maybe most
Yeah,
of it.
yeah, yeah,
We also,
yeah.
by the way, we have an appendix in our book, Your Emotional Type, um, where I guess it's actually the last chapter, is called Pushing Boundaries. And we talk about um, energetic therapies, bioenergetics, Reiki, things like that,
Right. Body
which sort of came to our
therapies.
attention as we were finishing up the book. We didn't delve into them, but we sort of it's the last chapter and sort of a PS, and so that was where we learned a few things in getting the book together.
Yeah, I would think that the whole suite of body therapies would be really important for this discussion.
Yeah, therapeutic touch and all of that,
Yeah, yeah.
because
Uh,
they revolve around concepts of energy. Um, People involved in those kinds of therapies consider themselves very often energy healers, which sounds kind of esoteric, but if you think that emotion, if you conceive of of emotion as energetic, then there's definitely physiology to it.